This is a slow-moving right-wing coup.
Well, 1932 was the depths of the Depression. The Depression came very hard and very fast to Germany following the stock market crash in the United States. In the summer of 1932, that marked the depths of the Depression in Germany. Fully one-third of the labor force was unemployed. That provides the essential background to the Nazi seizure of power. People were, understandably so, desperate in desperate economic conditions, and the psychological uncertainty created by the Depression was also a major factor.
But tell us in mechanical, political terms, what gave him the chancellor position?
A small group of very conservative, very wealthy, powerful men around the president, Paul von Hindenburg. These men were bankers, businessmen, estate owners, high civil servants, army officers, nobles. They convinced the president to appoint Hitler Chancellor of Germany. Hitler came to power in the end in a legitimate constitutional fashion. It was these conservatives who believed they could traffic with Hitler, do business with Hitler, believed they could control Hitler, who in the end brought the Nazis to power.
Why was he, you say it was constitutional, it was legal, but as you describe it, he was not elected. So take us through that, because I'm looking back here. I mean, in the late 20s, the Nazi Party was getting some elections, federal elections in Germany, down in the 2-3% range. So
yeah, that's absolutely right. The figure you just gave in 1928, at that point the Nazis were a marginal party. They were a police problem. They were not taken seriously by anyone. And then, following the onset of the Depression, they have this meteoric rise. They do very well in the elections of 1930, and then in the summer of 1932 reach their highest popular vote ever, 37.4% of the vote. But very importantly, that was not a majority. That was a significant segment of the electorate, to be sure, but not a majority. And then the following election, Germany was filled with elections in 1932. In November 1932, their vote tally declined to 34%. And we can see that in the autumn of 1932, the Nazi Party possibly could have disintegrated. There was opposition even within the ranks of the Nazi Party to Adolf Hitler's leadership. But then, as I mentioned, this conservative elite saves Hitler by convincing the president to appoint him Chancellor of Germany.
Hindenburg, who had been the big field marshal in World War I, was the president. Why did he hand it off to Adolf Hitler, who had not achieved a majority in the polls?
He did so reluctantly. He was convinced by that group of conservatives around him, which included his own son. That decision came after nearly 3 years of political paralysis in Germany, because the electorate and the political parties were highly fragmented. No one seemed to have a viable solution to these conservatives to get Germany out of the political crisis, out of the economic crisis, and to restore Germany's great power status.
So back up then. Here we are, 1933, he takes over. Well, I guess let's stick with it for a moment. You say that the conservatives who persuaded Hindenburg to bring in Adolf Hitler were persuaded that they would put a bit in his mouth after he became leader, right? They would control him. They would fence him in, I think was some of the language that was used.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, they all had a common political agenda. The Nazis were too radical, too low class for them, too populist, but the conservative elite and the Nazis had a common agenda that they were all extreme nationalists, anti-Semitic. The conservatives a little more politely anti-Semitic than the Nazis, but the anti-Semitism joined them together. They were all anti-communist and anti-socialist, and the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party were both very significant political forces in Germany, and they were fundamentally anti-democratic. And the entire country was opposed to the Versailles Peace Treaty that had ended World War II. So Hitler's promise to overturn the Versailles Treaty, to make Germany great again, to revive the economy, all of that went down well with the more traditional conservatives. And they thought they could use Hitler and the Nazis, and Hitler and the Nazis thought they could use the traditional conservatives. We know who won in that game.
Back up then. Hitler, as Volker Ulrich describes in his new history here, Hitler Ascent, it was described earlier on as a clown with a strangely scattershot, impulsive style. How did someone who was seen that way come to be considered suitable to lead a significant nation, any nation?
Well, he was seen that way by a left-wing and liberal intellectual elite, by many other leaders and common people in German society. They underestimated him enormously. At the same time, Hitler, he was a clown, but he also had phenomenal political instincts. He knew how to rally people. He knew how to use the new technologies of the 1920s, loudspeakers, radio, later on film in the Third Reich. That famous, infamous film by Leni Riefenstahl, where Hitler descends from the clouds in an airplane. Hitler was the first German politician to use an airplane, to move around rapidly from town to town, to deliver political speeches. So his political instincts were quite something, and they would continue to be so into the war years.
Here was Hitler. This was 1933. He'd been appointed, as you say, as leader of Germany. He delivered his first speech as chancellor. Here we go.
In uns selbst allein liegt die Zukunft des deutschen Volkes.
I'll translate a little bit here. He says, in our own hands alone lies the destiny of the German people. Only if we raise German people through their own labor, their own industry, their own determination and daring, their own perseverance, only then shall we rise again. Adolf Hitler in his first speech to Germany. It sounds, I mean, we've all seen this over the years, but it just sounds like way too amped up for a head of state. Were the Germans accustomed to that by that point? Had he made that normal?
No one was. They might have been accustomed to Hitler by that point, but no one was accustomed to it because radio only came into being in 1928, amplified sound around that same time. Political leaders had a hard time figuring out at first how they speak into microphones. Hitler understood all that very quickly. I have to say that for all the years I've studied and taught and written about German history, I still find it hard to understand how Germans found that voice so appealing. Obviously, it's not my native language. I understand it.
Yeah.
But I still don't understand how that voice was so appealing. And if you read memoirs and look at some of the photos and the films of the era, it even had an erotic appeal.
It's pretty wild. I mean, Hitler described by a magazine editor in 1930 as a half-insane rascal, a pathetic dunderhead, a fool, a big mouth.
Yeah, but that, of course, that was the problem. That was part of the problem, that people did not take him seriously. And by the time the Nazis had won roughly one-third of the electorate, they should have started taking him seriously.
How did the more moderate conservatives learn that they were not going to be able to control Adolf Hitler?
Well, the first government, by the way, the first Nazi government, had only 3 Nazis in it. The rest were civil servants.
You mean the cabinet?
The cabinet itself, yes. Civil servants, army officers, and other members of the traditional conservative elite. That reassured many members of the German population who either voted or for or watched the Nazi rise to power. That reassured them greatly. But then very quickly, the Nazis moved to create a dictatorial system. The Weimar Constitution, by the way, was never abolished in the 12 years of the Third Reich.
And it was a democratic constitution.
It was ripped to shreds. It was ripped to shreds in practice by the Nazis' use of violence and by clever political maneuvering.
Hitler was seen as a Munich rabble-rouser, self-obsessed. But I wonder how these things played. Hitler was often described, she writes here from the book, as an egomaniac who only loved himself, had a characteristic fondness for superlatives. a kind of, would you describe him as a narcissist? Why we think that
at the least,
at the very least,
at the least.
How did that work for him and not against him?
He was all those things, but he also, as I'd mentioned before the break, had very fine political instincts and could tap in, especially after the onset of the Depression, could tap into the discontent that so many Germans felt because of the economic crisis, the political paralysis, and so on. Somehow he made his own narcissism and his own psychology into a powerful political vehicle. One of Hitler's other biographers, Ian Kershaw, has written that at some time, he believes, probably 1937, 38, Hitler came to believe himself all the superlatives that were said about him. He came to believe, indeed, that he was the embodiment of the German race, and that the destiny of the German race was inextricably entwined with his own being and his own personality. I think Kershaw is right on that. I think up to a point, probably 1942, when the war started going against Germany, Hitler was able to parlay that into powerful political support, but not universal support. Again, we always have to remember that. But then it also contributed to the total destruction of Germany in World War II.
Kakatani reminds us from Ulrich here that Hitler was known, she writes, among colleagues for his bottomless mendacity. That means untruthfulness. And she quotes a former finance minister saying that he was, quote, so thoroughly untruthful that he could no longer recognize the difference between lies and truth. Editors of one edition of Mein Kampf, she reminds us, described his famous book, Mein Kampf, as, quote, a swamp of lies, distortions, innuendos, half-truths, and real facts. I mean, Germany was a country famous for its history of scholarship, its background in science. If he was a great liar, why didn't that disqualify him? Why didn't Germans see that and run him out on a rail?
Germany was a very fractured country, especially after the defeat in World War I and in the German Revolution of 1918-19. There was a very strong, long authoritarian tradition in Germany. There was also a very strong, long democratic tradition in Germany. The democratic tradition went back to the 1790s, certainly to the 1840s and the 1848 revolution. That the democratic part of Germany triumphed after World War I in the revolution of 1918-19 and in the establishment of the Weimar Republic, which was the most democratic political order that Germans had ever experienced. But that republic, which instituted all sorts of excellent social reforms, was a period of great cultural flowering, of sexual reform movements. That republic was also very fragile. It was battered by one crisis after another. It was probably the worst situation for any democratic system to be established in when it had to deal with the consequences of a lost war, the consequences of a vengeful treaty, the consequences of the hyperinflation of 1923-24, then followed by that, only 5 years later, the Great Depression. So we have to imagine a German generation born, let's say, in the 1890s or around 1900 that experienced one immense social crisis after another. Americans have nothing in their history to compare with that succession of crises within one generation. So when you understand that, you can understand why people were looking for some kind of solution.
So Ulrich writes, and I'm sure you would agree that Germany was in much worse shape than the United States. These days, of course, it was in bad shape. And yet Hitler talked about it in very, very dark terms. He talked about leading Germany to a new era of national greatness. And Ulrich says, it was better to paint the present day in hues that were all the darker. Everywhere you looked, there was only decline and decay. But was Hitler right in the way he described Germany? You described it.
No, he was not. He was right that there was economic crisis, that there was political paralysis. But he was wrong in the sense that the Weimar Republic offered people all sorts of new opportunities that they had never had in the old Wilhelmine imperial system before World War I. The Weimar Republic was offered Jews great opportunities. Although Jews faced anti-Semitism, to be sure, some of the professions from which they had been barred were opened up to Jews. People of different sexual orientations felt freer than they had ever felt before in Germany. It was clearly a period of great artistic and cultural innovation. Now, the Nazis hated all that, and many of their supporters hated all that. The Nazis called it, the marks of cultural degeneracy, often associated that with Jews. So in one phrase, you'd have Jews and cultural degeneracy linked together. But this was a highly fragmented society. For one part of the population, the Weimar Republic was a wonderful, energizing experience. For others, it was the mark of the decline of Germany.
Did those who opposed the Nazis see what was happening? Did they see what was coming? Why were they not more effective in opposing?
Almost no one was coming. And even communists as late as 1937, these are documents I've read when I wrote my first book, even as late as 1937, 4 years into the Third Reich, communists are writing that Hitler doesn't have long, and after him will take power. I mean, that kind of delusion is almost incredible to think about today. The Nazis were new, and Hitler was new. There were no previous political experiences, political models people could draw upon to make sense of what was happening.
Let me go to our callers, if I may. Eric Weitz is with us, author of Weimar Germany. Let's go to Buffalo, New York. Elizabeth, thank you for calling, Elizabeth. You're on the air.
Sir, Mr. Trump is embodying these same things that Mr. Hitler was doing. He knew how to manipulate media. We had a degenerative society as far as like us versus them, as well as I'm sorry, I'm choking.
I think I know the direction of where you're going. What you have just described is certainly true. Trump knows how to use the media very, very well. Trump knows how to divide people.
But you write, Eric, if I may. You write again, no serious political movement today in the West is anything like the Nazi Party. Yeah, and you write, Trump is not a fascist or a neo-Nazi. So is Elizabeth off base? What? How do you see it?
Well, that doesn't mean I like the guy.
Well, I'm not talking about liking. You can have whatever politics.
I just think that we have to be clear-headed in our political analysis and not exaggerate what I think are nefarious characteristics of Mr. Trump. What I think is the closest analogy is the fact that there are, shall we call them, more traditional conservatives who have made Trump acceptable. Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, go all down the line. That's the analogy that I think is most on point, if you will, with Hitler and the Nazis. Not like, Trump, yes, I think is a racist, is misogynist, is all these other things. But that doesn't make him Hitler, and it certainly doesn't make his movement Nazi-like, and to the extreme degree that the Nazis were. But it's the fact that so many Republicans have made Trump acceptable. That's what is really dangerous, I think.
This is sound from 1939, on just the 6th anniversary of his rise to power. Hitler talking to the Reichstag, the German parliament, laying out kind of a horrifying resolution to what he called the Jewish problem. Here's a clip that he made a prophecy that a world war would result in the annihilation of European Jews.
Ich will heute wieder ein Prophet sein. Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum
Adolf Hitler saying, "Today I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers inside and outside Europe succeed in plunging nations once more into a world war, the result will not be Bolshevization of the earth and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." And of course, came very close to happening. Brandon in Newport News, Virginia. Brandon, thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Hi, Tom. How are you?
I'm okay. Brandon, what do you see?
When I look at Donald Trump and I hear the rhetoric he's speaking, one of your guests was just saying, it's not that bad like it was in Europe and things like that, but we have to look at this thing on a personal level. Whatever an individual feels, how bad the situation is, that's his belief. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you start to influence a lot of other people who come together and feel the same way, that's an even bigger problem. I see Trump as that possible second Hitler. He was taken as a joke, getting into the race initially. Now look at where we are with him. Now, he gets in there, he creates this, as one of the callers just said, he creates this new doctrine to go around and round up a lot of the immigrants, legal or otherwise. I can see it becoming a situation where, like it was when the Nazis going around knocking at the doors, rounding up Jews and getting rid of them. Then after you get rid of let's say he's going after the Mexicans. After you get rid of the Mexicans, what he's going to go after then? The Muslims. When he gets rid of the Muslims, who's going to go after next? African Americans? I can speak for myself as an African American male. The hunt is already on when you look at what's going on with the way the cops are shooting black men, armed and unarmed. With the type of work that I do, I see it all day long, and I work up and down the Eastern Seaboard. And whenever I go to work in a local government, I go in and introduce myself not only to the town police, but also to the local sheriff.
To be good,
people will call in and just automatically assume the work.
To be good and careful. And you hear Brandon's worry about the future, Eric?
I do hear it, and I share those worries to a degree. The easiest thing in the world politically is for an effective public speaker, and we can debate whether Trump is or isn't, to rally the nationalist or the racist sentiments of people, and then to target the other, Jews in the 1930s and 40s, immigrants, migrants, African Americans today sometimes, as the enemy, the source of the problem. That's the easiest thing in the world to do politically. Trump has done it rather successfully, so has his analogs in various European countries.
Hello. Thanks for taking my call. I'm afraid I'm still on the area of he's too much of a comparison. Our inequalities will be addressed. We've heard it over and over and over again from Hillary and from Bernie.
Well, we'll see. Bernie didn't get the nomination. We'll see what will happen. The country has accepted stark inequality for a long time now. But where does it take you, Dorothy? What are you thinking?
I'm thinking that I can remember when I was a little girl. I'm 83 years old right now. When I was a little girl sitting in a car wondering why my uncle and my father are arguing about this man, Hitler. And my uncle had been born from a German family. He was my in-law uncle, and my father was an American, and they argued and argued and argued. And my father was right, and it was too late by that time. It's too late for all the people. We can't wait and say, well, we'll worry about it later. Let's see what he does. Let's not wait. Let's not vote for him, okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your call, Dorothy. We're looking at the rise of Adolf Hitler. Jim in Nashville, Tennessee. Jim, you're on the air. Thank you for calling.
Hi, Tom.
Hi.
See, I'm all but convinced that the biggest problem that we face right now with respect to our politics is a lack of engagement through lack of critical thinking on the part of the majority of the electorate here in America. And I'm wondering if there's any analogy to that in Germany in the 30s, where people's individual concerns for their own lives superseded any critical thinking they might do about events that might occur as a result of embracing Hitler down the line.
Let us pick it up, Jim. We're reminded again by Michiko Kakutani in a review of Volker Ulrich's book that Hitler, she virtually wrote the modern playbook on demagoguery, and in Mein Kampf, his book, he wrote that propaganda has to appeal to the emotions, not the reasoning powers of the crowd. He wrote, quote, "It's purely intellectual level, will have to be that of the lowest mental common denominator among the public it is desired to reach. That's Hitler, thinking about how to gain power. Was there a lack of engagement, a lack of critical thinking that's obvious to you in the years running up to Hitler's ascent, Eric Weitz?
I would not put it in those terms. Germany was, in fact, a highly politicized society, far more politically active and engaged than in the United States today. The problem was the deep fractures in that society, in that political system, so that even socialists and communists on the left could not get together in a common front against the Nazis. Liberals had been reduced to a minor political party, and then there were all sorts of other conservative and then minor conservative and minor left-wing parties as well. It was the fracturing, and that's also worrisome in terms of the United States, that we don't only have a fractured Congress and a paralyzed government in many ways, but that the society is so fractured.